So here we are, talk 9 of this Rethink Week at University of Alberta. I don't know how many of you have been tracking with the whole week. I obviously, like the speaking team, have been here for almost everything, and now I really am just running on caffeine. So if I'm looking a bit jet lagged this evening, I think I've talked so much, answered so many questions, I don't know whether I'm coming or going, which way is up or which way is down, although being only 5'6", I think every way is up, as are my colleagues. Kind of remind me, but great to be here this evening to address this topic, especially after the engagement with last night with Howard. I don't know how many of you were here last night. Very grateful. Oh, that was impressive. That's great. Siri has it in for me, so that may be the first of many interruptions this evening. So anyway, yeah, tonight this whole question then of why I'm personally not an atheist, but the second half of the question, why I love their questions, and hopefully we'll have a lively Q&A. And to kind of set the scene for where we're going this evening, it's interesting to note and to notice that we live very much in a kind of age of religion. Religion is not shrinking, actually, it's growing. And statistics from the Pew Forum, who are a North American think tank who kind of track global religion, predict that if you look at the trends right now, the nuns, not the little old ladies in black robes, but the NONESs, people with no religion, and that includes not just atheists, but people who say, I sort of don't know what I believe, is predicted to decline, actually, over the next 20 years or so, from 30 years or so, from 16% to 13%. Actually, all around the world, we're seeing the kind of revivification of religion. That certainly goes for the Christian faith. So, for example, in China, there are now over 100 million Christians. That's actually the conservative estimate. Some people put the figure as much as 150 million. And in fact, I think it was The Economist magazine, a writer for them, said that potentially within the next 25 years, China will become the world's most populous Christian country, which is interesting in terms of geopolitics. Or we could look the other direction. We could look into Africa, where there are over 400 million Christians in Africa now. And to put that in perspective, there were 9 million in 1900, and it's predicted to be 633 million by 2025, at which point Africa will be the most Christian continent, and the sort of center of mass of global Christianity kind of shifting south and east. And even in places where you would be surprised at the figures, in Iran, for example, in the Middle East, where we're seeing some very interesting demographic shifts. One of the most vibrant churches there in the Middle East, over 1 million Iranian Christians now. Hundreds of thousands, particularly of young Iranians, leaving Islam and going in one or two directions, either becoming Marxists and going into the atheist direction, or becoming Christians. So we live in very, very interesting times. And all of that sort of shift and all of those statistics, I start there really to just sort of raise the question, or show that these figures raise the question, that one of the things we have to think about is how we live together despite our differences. I think it's one of the biggest questions for humanity, whether here in Canada or whether around the world. How do we live with each other despite our differences? And one of the ways I think to do that is to recognize that we all have deeply held beliefs. Christians have deeply held beliefs, and Muslims have deeply held beliefs, and Hindus and Buddhists, and so on and so forth. And included in that sort of group of people who have deeply held beliefs are my atheist friends. I think atheists have deeply held beliefs, and we need to take that seriously if we're going to take one another seriously, listen to one another, and find ways to listen, to hear one another, and figure out how to live despite our differences. And interestingly, in fact, actually sociologically now and anthropologically, atheism is increasingly treated as a belief system in its own right, with its own set of beliefs and values and frameworks and so on, and is studied alongside other beliefs. Now, saying that, in some contexts, you occasionally get people raising their eyebrows and saying, I mean, really? Is atheism really a belief system? You know, surely it's just the absence of belief. And certainly a few high-profile atheists have tried to make that claim. Christopher Hitchens, one of my favorite atheist writers, who we sadly lost to cancer a few years ago. Christopher memorably put it, and most things that Christopher wrote were memorable. He had a real turn of phrase. He wrote this in one of his best-selling books on atheism. He said, "Our belief is not a belief. I have read that sentence at least 30 times in the last few years when giving this lecture or talk, and I'm still not quite sure what in fact he is doing. One of my hobbies is magic and conjuring tricks. I like a good trick when I see one. I think that's a trick with words, but he's trying to sort of push away from having, I think, to defend anything. Or one of the enthusiastic young skeptics who hang on my Twitter feed a year and a half ago, put it this way. These days we now have 280 letters, I think, on Twitter. He could have put it even longer. But into 140 characters back then, my friend put it this way. He said, atheism is not a claim or a belief. It's the absence of belief. It's a non-belief. Now, right at the top of this evening, I want to ask the question, is that true? Maybe you've heard something similar from other folks. Maybe you would self-identify as an atheist here this evening, and you're kind of nodding along, going, yes, I don't believe anything. My atheism is just the absence of belief. And I want to begin at the top of the evening by challenging that and saying that sounds very simple and very convenient. Problem is it's wrong, and the other problem is it leads to all kinds of curious quirks follow if that were true. If atheism was simply the lack of belief in God, then it would lead to curious conundrums like hippos would be atheists, for example, because as far as we know, they lack a belief in God. Rocks lack a belief in God. Toasters lack belief in God. Buses, Richard Dawkins' left foot list goes on and on and on. That can't be right. Left foot, right? No, never do that joke ever again. That tells us that simply saying atheism is the absence of belief is not quite good enough. We need to do better than that. Secondly, though, to show that I think atheism is more than the absence of belief, it functions for many people as an identity marker. I meet many people who self-describe as atheists, who come up to me after events like this and say, hi Andy, I'm an atheist. And that kind of self-description is interesting. People who don't believe in the tooth fairy don't introduce themselves that way. Nobody has yet come up to me and said, hello Andy, I'm an a-tooth-farian. Or a Santa Claus-arian, for example. I don't introduce myself that way at parties. I just don't get invited to those kind of parties. But, there we go. But many people I meet do use atheism as an identity marker. If you look on social media profiles, people, will use it as an identity marker, or enthusiastic ones will use the flying spaghetti monster there as their avatar on, Twitter or Instagram or something. And so that tells me something is going on. We're also seeing an increasing tendency for our atheist friends to gather together in communities centered around their atheism. They start groups on campuses. They attend conferences, they attend seminars, they buy books written by atheist gurus, and they have creeds. They're even starting churches. Now that may come as a surprise to you, but there are in fact atheist churches now. The first one, we think it was the first one, they claim to be the first one. There was an atheist church started in London about 5 or 6 years ago. Started by these two characters here, who are the leaders of it. They call themselves the Sunday Assembly, and they meet in a deconsecrated Anglican church in the middle of London, and they sing secular songs. They hear messages on everything from volunteering to climate change, and afterwards they have coffee and biscuits. I've long joked that I wonder whether we can sort of graph the intensity of atheist churches by studying the quality of the biscuits, because you can do that for Christian churches. High church, good biscuits; low church, not so good biscuits. Try it out sometime, and you can really tell different churches by the quality of the snacks. So this may eventually hold true for our atheist friends. Now, quite how a non-belief, if that's what atheism is, a non-thing, has performed quite so well as an identity marker, as a kernel of community, is quite mystifying. And in fact, the much simpler belief, the much simpler conclusion, is that atheism is in fact a belief system. And like other belief systems out there, from the political to the religious, it can form part of a person's identity, it can form part of a community's identity. And in short, atheism looks like a belief, it functions like a belief, and in fact it is a belief. Now, could we go further, and could some, and I'm stressing some, forms of atheism actually be described as a religion? Some anthropologists think so. So there is an anthropologist, there is a scholar of religion called Stephen Prothero, who's based at Boston University, wrote a phenomenally fascinating book called God Is Not One, looking at religious diversity around the world. And this is what he concludes. He writes, atheism is a religion of sorts, or it can be. Many atheists are quite religious, holding their views about God with the conviction of zealots and evangelizing with verve. It stands at the center of their lives, defining who they are, how they think, and with whom they associate. The question of God is never far from their minds. Or as I believe it may have been Woody Allen, I haven't yet managed to attribute the exact quotes, but as one comedian said, nobody talks quite so much about God as those who say he doesn't exist. Which is interesting. Or again, this is more academic. Take a more popular form of this. One of my heroes and someone I watch an awful lot of on YouTube is Penn Jillette, one half of the comedy magic act Penn and Teller. Penn Jillette is a well-known atheist, and in an article he wrote for National Public Radio's website in the USA a few months ago, this is what he wrote, and very much of the view that his atheism is a belief system. He says, "I believe that there is no God. But this I believe thing seems to demand something more personal, some leap of faith that helps one see life's picture, some rules to live by. So I am saying this I believe. I believe there is no God, and having taken that step, it informs every moment of my life." Interesting to reflect on that if you have a religious faith this evening, you could probably rerun Penn's paragraph and substitute Christianity or Islam or Buddhism, whatever you feel like, into that, and you'd come to the same conclusions. He's saying that his atheism animates everything he does, it changes the way he sees the world, and I have no problem with that. He's one of the most thoughtful atheists I have read. I enjoy engaging with his material. Now, I share all of this with you just to make the point, as we push into some of this, that we all have beliefs. There is actually no such thing as a non-believing human. And so that raises the question then of how do we choose? How do we choose what to believe? Do we just pick the belief that works for us? Do we pick what feels good? Do we pick what our friends think? How do we compare beliefs? How do we, decide what might or might not be true? Well, I want to suggest to you this evening that a really good way to compare belief systems, to examine belief systems, is to see which one best explains the evidence, rather than look for knockdown arguments, because I don't think there are knockdown arguments. I don't think there's a knockdown argument for Christianity. I don't think there's a knockdown argument for Islam or for atheism or for why British is the best way to pronounce English words, or so on. And so that's just taken as a given, right? You know this. But rather, I think what you do is you weigh a whole range of evidence. You can look at a whole range of lines of evidence in the case of Christianity. Evidence from science, evidence from philosophy, from art and aesthetics, from history and from ethics, and to ask what best explains the evidence. And the reason that I am not an atheist, and the reason that I am a Christian, is I think when you do that, when you weigh the evidence together, then I think ultimately atheism is found wanting, although it has some important things to say, and I must listen to my atheist friends and fellow academics, but ultimately I think the evidence points in the direction of Christianity being true when you weigh those facts together. So what I want to do this evening, over the next half an hour or so, is I'm going to give you, in fact, 6 lines of evidence, 6 pieces of data, which individually, you may look at them and go, well, okay, something to think about there, but I'm not convinced. But I'm not asking you to weigh them individually. As we go, I'm asking you, as it were, to put them in the scales and weigh them together and see where taken together the leaders. I'm going to set that out for you over the next half hour or so, and then my colleague Alicia Woods, wherever she's hiding, is going to come. Oh, there she is, second row, with soft fruit ready to throw, is going to come and join me and answer your questions. She loves really difficult questions, so if you've got any really hard ones this evening, Alicia would deeply appreciate that. Now, she's really giving me a look. Now, here we go. First piece of evidence then this evening. I promised you 6. Here is numero uno. The first piece of evidence I have for you, first thing to think about is this. Why does science work? Science is one of the best things that human beings have ever invented. It's given us medicine, it's given us space technology, it's given us the iPhone, science has given us Sheldon Cooper, the list goes on and on and on. Thank you, those people who do watch modern television. And but have you ever asked yourself the question, why does science actually work? For example, science depends on a number of things. Science depends upon the universe and the laws of physics being stable and repeatable and logical, but it doesn't actually have to be that way. We could have found ourselves living in a universe where everything was random, nothing was consistent, and we wouldn't be able to do science in the first place. That problem, that puzzle, actually kept Albert Einstein awake at night. He wrote and reflected on that quite frequently as one of the great physicists of the last century, and concluded there was no answer that he could see other than it pointed in a suspiciously theistic direction. We take it for granted as people, particularly those of us who love the sciences, but why does science work in the first place? There's a sort of subset of that question which particularly concerns physics, which is we have the strange enigma of how fine-tuned and precisely balanced some of the laws of physics actually are. For example, the gravitational constant that binds everything together. That's not the force in Star Wars, that's the gravitational constant. Again, don't do that joke ever again. You guys don't get out. There's this great thing called television and film. You should go try it sometime. It's really exciting. Has it reached Edmonton yet? Now, no, said one person. The gravitational constant in physics is a very interesting number. It's very precisely balanced. If the gravitational constant, the force of gravity, was just a tiny bit stronger than it actually was, then after the Big Bang, the universe would have collapsed back in on itself, and there'll be nothing here to talk about. On the other hand, if the gravitational constant was just a tiny bit weaker, then everything would have sort of whizzed out into space after the Big Bang. Cosmic expansion would have carried on so rapidly there would be no stars, planets, galaxies, or anything worth talking about. And that's just one of dozens of examples. And in fact, since the 1970s, physicists have been studying this whole phenomena of fine-tuning. And it's largely not Christian scientists who are working on this. It's just secular physicists who are wrestling away on this mystery. And it is a mystery because so fine-tuned, so well-balanced are many of the laws of physics, it does raise a puzzle. Fred Hoyle was a British cosmologist and physicist, strident atheist. In fact, it was Fred who invented the term Big Bang. He didn't like the idea of the Big Bang. He thought it raised embarrassing questions about God and made God more likely, so he rubbished it, and he called it this ridiculous Big Bang nonsense, and the term stuck. Well, Fred, in one of the last journal articles he wrote before his death, looking at this fine-tuning problem, reflected this way. He said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me to be so overwhelming so as to put this beyond question. Now, of course, if the God described by the Bible exists, that gives us a good explanation for why science works, for why the universe is repeatable and logical and rational, and why those laws of physics are so intricately and carefully designed. They point to a careful designer who built that in to the reality that we find ourselves in. But let's stick with science for a moment as we move on to my second piece of evidence. So there's why science works, and within that, why the laws of physics are so carefully and beautifully and intricately designed. But things get even more interesting in the sciences when we look at another very peculiar aspect of science, and that's the strange fit between science and maths. See, the laws of physics are beautiful things, and they're constructed using the language of mathematics. And numbers describe and work well in physics very, very well. But back in, I think it was the 1950s, a Hungarian physicist and mathematician called Eugene Wigner wrote a world-famous journal article called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and the Physical Sciences. And he simply raised this question: why does maths work? Why does it work? Well, you may be thinking, why is that a puzzle? Why is that a question? Well, think about this for a moment. If there is no God and numbers are just a human invention, then, well, what is a number? What is the number 2? Or the number 6? Or the number 9? Or whatever? Well, if there is no God, of course, numbers are just a human invention, something that Mesopotamian goat herders came up with sometime in the 2nd millennium to keep track of their flocks. But if that is the case, how on earth is it that numbers and mathematics so beautifully can describe things like the curvature of space-time, the interior geometry of black holes, the growth patterns of flowers, or the orbit of planets and electrons? Did those goat herders just get really, really lucky? Or is there something else going on? Well, Paul Davies, who is an astrophysicist at Arizona State University, remarks this way. He says, "This is one of the deepest mysteries in science. Why is nature shadowed by a mathematical reality? Why does theoretical physics work?" Well, you see, on atheism, this is a lucky coincidence. Good old goat herders, thankfully they got it right, and we can do physics and so on and so forth. They had a lot of foresight. Or something else is going on. I think something else is going on. And I think this very fortunate, lucky, wonderful fit between maths and physics and maths and the sciences is another clue, another pointer, another data point on the graph pointing to the fact that those laws of physics that we take for granted, that we enjoy experiencing and studying, are intricately and carefully designed and point towards a designer. Let's move on, though, into a different area now. We've talked a bit about the origins of science for a moment, and science obviously requires a universe that's stable, ordered, mathematical, rational, and so on. But let's talk about us and rationality for a moment. We often, as human beings, we like to think we're rational, we like to think we're smart, we like to talk about, we like thinking about things. Sarah, in her introduction, talked about how she, liked to be seen as a thinker, and this whole discussion often between, people who have a religious faith and those who don't, it can sometimes feel like a game of one-upmanship. Who can show off the most, quote the most names, and look like they're the cleverest? Well, have you ever thought, though, for a moment about your thinking for a moment? Have you ever noticed, in fact, in order for your thoughts to be rational, you need to hold them for good reason? For example, let's imagine that someone here in this audience believes that the Oilers are the best hockey team in the world. I'm sure nobody believes that. You're all Leafs fans, right? Now, that alone might make me ask some questions, but I'll be polite. I'm your guest here in this city. But then we discover something. I reveal the horrible truth to you. We reveal, the panels behind me slide back, we reveal this is actually a TV prank show. And actually, as you entered the room and took a swig of the juice at the back, we had put mind-altering drugs into the drinks this evening. And the only reason you believe the Oilers are the best hockey team in the world is because we drugged you, and then Don Cherry stepped out from behind a plant pot and hypnotized you. That is why you are there going, Oilers, Oilers, Oilers. Now, here is your problem. Here's the problem. If atheism is true, or at least atheistic naturalism is true, we are in exactly the same position. We believe what we believe because your brain is fizzing away between your ears in a sort of glorious, happy way, fizzing away, doing the kind of chemical reactions it likes to do, and you like to imagine that you're thinking, but actually you're not. You're just fizzing, and it's just the illusion of thought that you're projecting nicely to those around you. Now, last night in my dialogue with Professor Nye, I mentioned Raymond Tallis, who is a wonderfully iconoclastic atheist philosopher and neuroscientist. And this book, if you want to push further into what I'm arguing in this particular point, is worth reading because it is a spectacular attack on the idea that you can get mind and consciousness out of kind of atheistic materialism. And it's a fun book because to spoil the ending, he doesn't become religious at the end. He sort of concludes he doesn't know, but he's pretty certain he knows that the answer isn't what many of his fellow atheists think that it is. There's a big puzzle for atheism on how you get mind and consciousness and rationality. Or as an atheist of a previous generation, J.B.S. Haldane, very famous biologist from the middle of the 20th century, memorably put it. He said, if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motion of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. They may be sound chemically, that doesn't make them sound logically. And he actually goes on to say, therefore, ironically, I can't actually believe that my brain is made of atoms in the first place, and you end up in this wonderful vicious circle that you can't break out of. Now, how does God potentially help us here? Well, at the very least, the believer in God, like me, has the ability to say, well, I'm quite relaxed with the idea that material things are not the only things that exist. In fact, I would gently suggest that every time you think, or you reason, or you use your mind, or you argue, or you believe anything, you are reminding yourself that minds exist, and the moment you remind yourself that minds exist, you are reminding yourself there is a non-material substance in the universe like your mind, and of course, if non-material substances like mind exist, there might be another out there, potentially the ultimate source of mind itself. And once again, we have another potentially good argument for the Christian faith to add to that set of scales along with the other ones. If you are somebody who prides yourself on thinking well, you might want to ask yourself some questions about whether you might be better located in Christianity to do that thinking well and with a foundation behind it. Now, we've covered a lot of science in the last 15 minutes. Those of you who are not sciencey are probably sitting there thinking, is Sheldon Cooper himself going to step out from behind the giant question mark? To put your mind at ease, we are going to now leave the sciences behind and go in a different direction. Let's talk about some different arguments and evidences for the Christian faith from a different direction. And the first one of these I want to talk about for a few moments. We talked about a little bit about last night for those who were there, but we're going to push into it a bit more this evening. And that's the whole question of human rights and dignity. Let me read you a paragraph from arguably one of the most important, certainly legal documents written in the last 100 years. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, first formulated in 1948. I'm going to read you a paragraph from the preamble to that, and it begins like this. It says, "Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom and justice and peace in the world. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." Wonderful, laudable document, and stands behind a lot of work that's been done in justice and so forth has come out of this document and the human rights movement. Now, but those words, especially the ones that I've put in light colour up there on the keynote slide for you, raise a profound question. Where is that dignity located? It's one thing to talk about human dignity, but where is it located? How is this just a useful fiction, or do we actually really have this dignity of which that document speaks? Now, to show why we have a slight conundrum here, let me again do a little thought experiment for you. Imagine we were to draw a circle. And in this circle is the genome, the DNA of every living thing on planet Earth. Everything from amoeba to ants to aardvarks to lettuces to human beings to real estate agents. Everything is located there inside that circle. Now, when we talk of human rights, it's interesting to think, what are we doing when we talk about human rights or human responsibility or human dignity? What we're doing is we're doing this. We're drawing a smaller circle inside that big circle and saying, if you live inside the smaller circle, if you have human DNA, if you have a human genome, then you have human rights, human dignity, human whatever. But we're basically drawing a circle. Now, why is there a problem here? Well, here's the problem. What's to stop the white supremacist coming along and drawing a smaller circle and saying, no, dignity and rights and those other things you've talked about don't belong to all members of the human family. They only belong to a subset of the human family. Problem we have is that I've drawn an arbitrary circle. Our supremacist over here, he or she has drawn an arbitrary circle. Those circles both appear to be arbitrary, yet one of them is laudable and wins Nobel Prizes for human rights, and the other one we lock up, we prosecute, we deplatform, all those things for this person at this end of the discussion. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, well, this is purely academic. Does this really matter? Well, it does, actually, and in history, particularly, and more recent history than we might imagine, this has had some real impact, and there's been real issues around this. In 1857, so 160 years ago, an African-American slave named Dred Scott sued his owner for his freedom. Very significant legal case in the history of human rights, the Dred Scott case. You can Google it if you want to read the whole text of the legal cases there online. Now, he sued his owner for his freedom. That case made it to the US Supreme Court. And the US Supreme Court ruled against him. They concluded he did not have the right to sue his owner for his freedom. Let me read you what the justices said in the Dred Scott decision. They wrote this: "The question is simply this. Can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen? One of which rights is the privilege of suing in a court of the United States in the cases specified in the Constitution." We think not, and that they, in this case i.e. Africans, are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. One reads a passage like that, 160 years on, and winces with embarrassment at how appallingly our ancestors, in the case of some of us in this room, behaved. Yet the problem remains. All the justices did, for all that we look at this and go, what were they thinking? All they did was draw a circle. They simply drew an arbitrary circle, just a slightly smaller circle than most of us in this room, hopefully all of us in this room this evening, will be comfortable with drawing, but they are random circles nonetheless. And thus the question arises, how do we break out of that dilemma? How do we hold on to the language of dignity, which is so important, yet how do we avoid this kind of problem? I would very politely suggest that I don't think atheism offers us much of a way out of that dilemma, but I think that Christianity does. Don't take my words for it. Take the words of a human rights advocate, a philosopher, an ethicist called Raymond Gaita, Australian atheist philosopher who has written immensely on this subject and these kind of issues. Raymond, who's a committed atheist, nevertheless writes these words. He says, "We may say that all human beings are inestimably precious, that they are ends in themselves, that they are owed unconditional respect, that they possess inalienable rights, and of course, that they possess inalienable dignity. In my judgment, these are just ways of trying to say what we feel a need to say when we are estranged from the conceptual resources we need to say it. Be that as it may, each is problematic and each is contentious. Not one of them has the simple power of the religious way of speaking." What he is hinting at there, and if you read his essay he goes on into, is the idea built into the biblical text, built into the Jewish and the Christian tradition of saying that human beings bear the imago Dei, the image of God, gives you a very, very straightforward and secure platform for a lot of things we are trying to say when we use the language of human rights. And he has not yet found a better model than that one, even though he disagrees with some of the where it comes from profoundly. So we've looked at science, we've looked at reason and thinking, we looked at mathematics, looked at human rights. There's an issue connected to human rights that I want to talk about for my penultimate point this evening. We've got 4 down, 2 to go. The penultimate point I want to talk about this evening is something we touched on last night in some of the wide-ranging conversation that Howard and I had last night, and that's the concerns the whole question of morality, and especially the reality, the actual reality of good and evil. You know, this year, 2018, is the 74th anniversary of the death, the execution, in fact, of 2 heroes of mine, Hans and Sophie Scholl, and in fact their biography has just been released in a 75th anniversary edition. So if some of what I say this evening intrigues you, I encourage you to grab this book on Amazon. It's a very powerful read. Who were Hans and Sophie Scholl? You may not have heard of them. Well, you may not have heard of those names, but if you were to go to Germany, and if you were to go to Munich, and if you were to go to one of the big universities there in Munich, Ludwig Maximilian University, you would find an entire university plaza dedicated to the memory of this brother and sister. Who were they? Well, Hans and Sophie were a German brother and sister who in 1941, whilst at university, became Christians. And they very quickly realized that their newfound faith meant they had to take a stand against the Third Reich. And with the help of some friends of theirs, some fellow students, and also one of their university professors, they formed a group called the White Rose Group. And they began to distribute anti-Nazi leaflets, particularly trying to mobilize students and the student body at their university and other campuses to take a stand and a stance against Hitler and the evil of the Third Reich. Well, on the 18th of February, 1943, Hans and Sophie brought a suitcase full of leaflets to their university, and they left piles of them in the corridors and on the windowsills outside classrooms for students to find when they came out of their lectures. They had a few pamphlets left And deciding they didn't want to waste them, they climbed up to the stairs to the top of the atrium and flung the last remaining pamphlets sort of over the edge so they would scatter down into the courtyard. Unfortunately, they were spotted by a janitor. The authorities were called, the group were rounded up, and they were arrested by the Gestapo. 4 days later, they were tried. They were found guilty of high treason, and they were all sentenced to death by guillotine. Sophie's last words before she was beheaded were these. She said, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give themselves up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Now, most of us would, I hope, look at Hans and Sophie Scholl and the other students who were killed as a result of that case and consider them moral heroes, incredibly brave people. Sophie, aged just 21, willing to give her life in order to make a difference and to take a stand against evil. And by contrast, I imagine we would want to look at the Nazi regime, the Third Reich, and all of the evils that it did, not just least what it did to these university students, and consider that regime monstrous and evil and so forth. But of course, then very quickly, you run into a little conundrum. How are you making that moral judgment? Isn't it just personal preference? That means we prefer what Hans and Sophie and their fellow White Rose conspirators did, and a personal preference that means we prefer that to what the Third Reich did. Now again, don't just take my words for the fact this is a conundrum. Listen to the words from Joel Marks, who is an atheist, ethicist, philosopher, teaches at New Haven University in the US. He comes right out and says it. He says, "The religious fundamentalists are correct. Without God, there is no morality. But they are incorrect, I believe, about there being a God. Hence, I believe there is no morality." Too often, people believe or can fall into the trap of believing we can simply throw God out and keep all of the morality and the ethics and the ideas and thinking about good and evil that have traditionally been based on him. But I think that is foolishness, as no less an atheist than Friedrich Nietzsche, probably one of the greatest atheist minds of the last 200 years, remarks. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, he said, "If you abandon the Christian faith, at the same time, you are pulling the right to Christian morality right out from under your feet. This morality is very far from self-evident. This point needs highlighting time and again. Christianity is a whole system, a synoptic and thought-out complete view of things. If you break one part of it, one of its principal concepts, the belief in God, then you shatter the whole thing. Nothing necessary is left between your fingers." Now, I happen to believe that we live in a moral universe. I happen to believe we live in a universe in which there really is good, in which there really is evil. I happen to believe that the Scholls were really, really good, that they were brave and virtuous, and that is truly real. I also happen to believe we live in a universe in which evil is real, and Hitler was really, really monstrous, genuinely evil. But if that is the case, if we live in a universe with those moral realities, I think that is another piece of evidence for Christianity that we can place with those others on the scales that I used in my illustration at the start. So we've looked at science, we've looked at good and evil, we've looked at human rights, and so on and so forth, and the whole fact we can think in the first place. I want to give you one last piece of evidence, and then we'll draw the threads together, wrap it up. Alicia will come and join me, and we will have some questions. I want to talk about history for a few minutes as we just begin wrapping this up and drawing this to a close. You see, we've been talking tonight as if Christianity is a philosophy or an ethic or a religion even, when fascinatingly that is never actually how it's been traditionally presented. You may, if you've ever come to Christian events before, or hung around Christians at all, or had perhaps some kind of Christian upbringing years ago, or a Christian today, in fact, you will have heard Christians use this word to describe what they believe. It's the word gospel. And Christians love talking about this word. What does the word gospel mean? Well, the English word gospel is the English equivalent of a Greek word used in the New Testament. The New Testament was written in Greek, and the word in the New Testament is the word euangelion, which means quite literally good news. That was the way that Christians for 2,000 years have traditionally described what they believe. Why is that significant? Well, Professor N.T. Wright, one of the world's leading historians on the early Christian movement, and based at St Andrews University in Scotland, just down the road from where my family and I live, wrote this in one of his books. Tom Wright wrote these words. He said, "Many people today assume that Christianity is a religion, a moral system, a philosophy. In other words, they assume that Christianity is about advice. But it wasn't, and it isn't. Christianity is simply good news. It's the news that something has happened, as a result of which the world is a different place. One can debate the merits of a religion, or a moral system, or a philosophy, but a news event is discussed in a different way. Either the event happened or it didn't, and if it did happen, either it means what people say it means, or else it doesn't. And the news that stands at the heart of the Christian faith is not some sort of abstract sort of belief about a God who perhaps is out there somewhere theoretically, who wound the clockwork of the universe up and sort of created a few bits and pieces and disappeared off, never to be seen again. But the news at the heart of the Christian faith concerns a God who steps into space and time in the person of Jesus Christ, and about who we can actually know, not just know things about. And Christians are people who have looked at the life and the teaching and the character and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, concluded the story of the life of Jesus stands up, that his character stands up, that his claims, which were incidentally so outrageous they got him crucified, those claims stand up. And in particular, that all of the claims that he made about himself were vindicated when he rose from the dead. It is the life and the death, the resurrection of Jesus on which Christianity primarily stands, and for which there is phenomenal, overwhelming historical evidence into which we can press during the Q&A if people want to go into that particular line of discussion. Now, if Jesus is who he claimed to be, did what he claimed to do, becoming to do, then that's good news. And yes, we could test good news intellectually, but we can also test good news existentially, because news is only good news if it changes something. I used this final illustration in a lunch bar the other day, so if you've heard this one before, I apologize for repeating myself, but if you hang around me long enough, people will tell you all of my jokes repeat themselves eventually, multiple times. 21 years ago, this coming April, I met my wife on the 1st of April 1997, April Fool's Day, which she continues to remark is deeply, deeply ironic. And on the 30th of August 1997, I asked Astrid to marry me. And amazingly, she said yes. I still can't kind of quite believe that she said yes, but there we go. And so I rushed out to tell everybody. I told friends, I rang up friends, I sort of spread the news everywhere that the most incredible, the most wonderful, the most beautiful woman in the world had agreed to marry me, and there was no alcohol involved. It was a true miracle. Now, let's suppose that one of my friends, a philosophy student at Oxford University, that sort of type. I have a few friends like that, interesting characters. Imagine I rang my friend up and told him what had happened, and he said, "Andy, that's a really interesting claim that you and Astrid are engaged. Let's test that utterance you have just delivered to me over the telephone using modal logic and see how it aligns with the philosophy of Aristotle, Wittgenstein, and Kant. Then we can decide whether it's rational and justified and coherent for you to make the claim that you are engaged." My friend's response would just possibly have missed something. Just a tiny, tiny little thing he might just have missed. Primarily, he would have missed that I was not making a philosophy argument. I was not advancing the outline of an argument I planned to publish in the Journal of the Philosophy of Religion. Rather, I was giving him a piece of news. In which case, the only two things that mattered were, was that news true, and did it mean what I was interpreting it to mean? My world changed with that piece of news 21 years ago, but the news at the heart of the Christian faith is even more world-changing. Because philosophical arguments are important, they're hugely important, they're great fun, and we can dig into them and take them seriously, but they can also sometimes be used as decoys and distractions. See, if Jesus is who he claimed to be, Christianity doesn't just merely make sense, it is sense. It is the true story of reality and of who God is and who we are. Who would not want to be part of that? So, in conclusion, I'm not an atheist because I have examined and continue to examine, because I love these kind of discussions, the evidence that is out there, and I believe that Christianity makes the better sense of all of these pieces of data. And if we had time, I have about another 20 or 30 stored away in various presentations, and I think Christianity makes the best sense of that entire package. But one thing I do value is the fact that over the years, the questions my atheist friends have challenged me with and asked me have really, really helped me sharpen my thinking. That's why we called the sort of subtitle to tonight's presentation was Why I Love Their Questions. My atheist friends have encouraged me to think outside the box. They've encouraged me to talk about questions that matter. They've encouraged me to embrace the calling of the university to be a place where we talk about life's big questions. They have introduced me to some phenomenal reading and authors and arguments that I have enjoyed wrestling with and grappling with. But at the same time, they also remind me in some of the conversations I've had with friends who self-describe as atheists in different parts of this world, they've also reminded me just to think carefully about our own prejudices. One last quotation for you this evening. This comes from Thomas Nagel, who's a well-known American atheist philosopher. And I think his comment here is a very, very interesting one. Thomas Nagel writes these words in his book, The Last Word. He says, "I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God, and I naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I don't want there to be a God. I hope there is no God. I don't want the universe to be like that." I appreciate his honesty in being very direct about his prejudices and his biases. We all need to be aware of our prejudices and our biases, and I respect Thomas's willingness to put them out there. Very last thought for you. In the Bible, in the New Testament, and the Gospel of John, the fourth of the four biographies of Jesus of Nazareth you can find in the Bible, there is a fascinating story in the first chapter of that biography of Jesus, where John reports an encounter between some of the followers of Jesus and some of the disciples of a man called John the Baptist. John the Baptist was a very popular religious teacher in the first century. He had huge crowds, he was very popular, a big social media following, all of that kind of thing. And he also had students. And the Bible, the Gospel of John, records an encounter between some of Jesus' followers and some of John's followers. In particular, it records an encounter between a guy called Andrew, who had a brother called Peter, and Philip, who brought a skeptical friend called Nathanael to meet Jesus. John tells us, the next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one that Moses wrote about in the law in the Old Testament, the Jewish Torah, and about the one about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nazareth, Nazareth, exclaimed Nathanael, "can anything good come from there?" "Come and see," said Philip. Interesting little encounter, right? Nathanael, in that incident, was a snob. Probably said it in a British accent, actually, I hate to confess. "Hey, say, Nazareth? Can anything good come from there?" It's an Oxford accent for you. He was proud. He was prejudiced, and of course he tried to dismiss Jesus before he'd even met him. Hadn't even talked to him. Oh, he's come from there. He's come from Nazareth. And interesting, if you read the full story in John chapter 1, it's a lot of fun actually, because Jesus sort of takes Nathanael under his wing and just very gently takes his skepticism seriously, answers his questions, has a bit of fun with him, and then turns him sort of round, and it turns Nathanael's life around. And in closing, I just want to say to you, if you are not a Christian here this evening, that's fine. That's great. You're very, very welcome. And as Sarah said in the introduction, get searching and get questioning. The journey is a lot of fun. But I do want to say the same thing that was said to Nathanael. Come and see. Put aside your prejudices, if you have some of those. We all do. Join the club. Put aside your fears. Put aside your narrow-mindedness. Come and see. Bring your questions. Bring your objections. Bring your doubts. Those are absolutely welcome. Don't let them hold you back, because Jesus welcomes you, arms open, questions and all. Come and see. Come and see. Because when you do, I believe you won't merely discover that Christianity is true. This is not some kind of philosophical game, but I truly believe that you will discover, as I discovered 25 years ago, as Sarah discovered just a few years ago, as many of us in this room discovered, for some of us a long time ago, for some of us more recently, that you will find in Jesus the only one who can meet our deepest need for forgiveness, for peace, for identity, for love, and for welcome. Come and see. Thanks for listening. Sarah.